Thanks for tuning in to the Generals Redoubt's podcast series, Generally Speaking, an alumni history of Washington and Lee University. This series is all about our alma mater's unique heritage. Join us each episode as we discuss the critical characters and events that transformed a small Scots-Irish academy into one of the premier institutions in America. Hear from alumni, students, and professors as they share their experience and perspective on these moments, and most importantly, understand why we must instill current and future generations of generals with a passion for Washington and Lee's past. I'm your host, Kamron Spivey, recording from Fancy Hills Podcasting Studio. Hope you can visit us sometime soon. I'm joined today by Louisa Rudolph, a sophomore who will be speaking to us about the Franklin Society, a historic debate society based in Rockbridge County throughout the 19th century that we've recently re-established here at Fancy Hill as part of TGR's commitment to promoting civil discourse within the broader Washington and Lee and county community. So before I go any further, Louisa, do you want to introduce yourself and sort of what your interest is in Washington and Lee and history?
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. Thank you for having me on. So I'm a sophomore here at WNL, and I'm double majoring in American history and American politics. I've always loved learning about American history. It's always fascinated me. So I was really eager when I got here to learn more about Washington and Lee since it's so old. So one of the things I have been doing for the General's Redoubt is exploring more of Washington and Lee's history, particularly looking at Revolutionary War period with America's 250th birthday this year. So I've got to learn a lot about Liberty Hall Academy and then also, of course, looking at the Franklin Society.
Great. If anyone listening hasn't checked out our website, www.thegeneralsredoubt.us, there's a tab on WNL history. Louisa basically runs that page. She's always producing more content for it, a lot of historical highlights, primary sources. We have our Following Washington series that gives us sort of month-by-month update on where General Washington was and what he was up to exactly 250 years ago. We have other publications from former WNL presidents, sort of as an example of great leadership, and then we've got pieces on Lee Chapel. Really, any time Louisa finds something interesting, I tell her to just publish it, and our followers can enjoy that material. So, Louisa, you've been working for us for about a year doing this research. Is this anything that Washington and Lee history in general, is this something that you're learning outside of the work with us? Is it something that's talked about on campus, or sort of what's your experience with this material?
I've definitely learned the most about our school's history through my work with the General's Redoubt. It's not talked a lot, I feel like, on campus, but I have learned through writing papers about Virginia's history or more local history, different things about Washington and Lee will come up. And I'll often go to special collections for research papers, and so things about the school will pop up then, but I usually have to go looking for it.
Mm-hmm. So you've taken a lot of history classes here?
Yes, a lot of history classes.
Yeah, any in particular that you have really enjoyed?
I think my favorite history class I took here was during my first semester as a freshman, the Civil War class with Dr. Myers.
Yeah, I took that my freshman year, and it was a great class. Really introduced me to the world of Washington and Lee, the sort of history and culture. There's a lot tied in there, so it's a good primer to go through your WNL experience with that in mind. A lot of people never take it at WNL, which is a shame. I think they're missing out. So let's go ahead and jump into the Franklin Society. For those that don't know, could you give just sort of a brief overview of what that is, and then we'll get more into the specifics of it and how it changed over time?
So the Franklin Society was a literary debating society, started around 1800 in Lexington and continued throughout the 19th century here. It was really influential. A lot of the leading members of Lexington were a part of it. They gathered weekly and had weekly lectures to debate on basically anything from political matters to literary matters to just silly questions like, is it rational to pray for rain? They would just talk about anything, and it was open discussion. You weren't allowed to make rude remarks. It was just a good place for civil discourse.
And it seems like it was a pretty encompassing group in terms of it wasn't just Washington and Lee professors or educators. It was really anybody in Rockbridge County that felt like they could contribute to a civil discussion. Is that correct?
Yeah, you had anyone from lawyers to professors to farmers to students at Washington and Lee who were members of it.
Yeah, and one of the really interesting details, I think, is the overlap between the university and the broader Rockbridge County community in this concept that was really pioneered by people like Henry Ruffner, who was president of the college in the sort of mid-antebellum period, who emphasized this idea of practical science and practical education and sort of wanting to take the yeoman farmer and teach him a lot of intellectual thought to both improve their physical crop yield, but also just make them a more informed citizen. You got to think that this is in the early republic, and this American experiment that we've had the privilege of being under for 250 years back then was pretty young and pretty vulnerable. And so the intellectual leaders of the community in this sort of Presbyterian community, they really put a lot of stock in having not just the college educated academics who know Latin and Greek be involved, but everyone in the community, and that only through this broad sort of communal education process do you have a well-informed democratic populace who can help shape the future of the republic. So the Franklin Society seems like a critical part to that, and we'll get more into the specifics of that. Another similar organization, I think, is the Rockbridge Agricultural Society, which actually met here at Fancy Hill for a period in the antebellum era, and it seems like there's a lot of overlap between members of that and the Franklin Society. But let's get more specifically into the history of the organization itself. You said it formed in the early 1800s, and it's the Franklin Society, but I don't think that was the original name, right?
Yeah, so they don't know the exact date it started, but around the year 1800, it started as the Lettres Society. And it was pretty informal. Members would gather weekly at different people's houses at candlelight, they would say, so in the evening, get together and talk. And then in 1804, they changed their name to the Union Society, and they drew up their first formal constitution.
Have you seen that at all, the Constitution?
Yes, I got to see it. We have it here in special collections.
Oh, that's great.
And then from the Union Society, they switched their name again in around 1807 to the Republican Society, and then the Literary Society. And then in 1811, they decided to be the Franklin Society.
Yeah, and named after Benjamin Franklin?
Yes, they decided to name themselves after Ben Franklin since he was an example of a good educator, having opened the first public library, University of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania Gazette. They thought he was a good model of what they aspired.
And he's on the $100 bill. Probably not back then, but he's a good example. And again, Franklin's one of these great examples in our American founding that is, I feel like pretty popular today even. He doesn't have much controversy around him like some of our other founding fathers do, but in his time was very much a proponent of this yeoman education, that the common citizen farmer can be educated and can sort of be the ruling class. And he was aristocratic in many ways, but also very egalitarian. So I think him being named after that society is a good example. And it's interesting, you said it was named the Republican Society at one point. And I wonder if that's maybe a nod to Jefferson and that Jeffersonian republic concept.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. Yeah, that early republic mindset, again, moving away from the aristocratic, more egalitarian, everyone can have a say, moving towards more universal white suffrage. And so it makes sense that they would name that after the Republican idea, since they're moving towards educating everybody and giving everyone a voice.
Mm-hmm. So it's named the Franklin Society, and does that ever change? Is it the Franklin Society till whenever it is abolished or sort of fades away?
Yes, from 1811, they get their official charter in 1816, and they are the Franklin Society until they break apart in 1891.
Okay, so that's a pretty big period, lots of crossover there. What are some of the fundamental rules of order that you see consistent throughout that almost 100-year span from the early days as, the Union or Republican Society to late post-bellum era?
So there was a big emphasis on civil discourse, obviously, since that was the whole point of the society. So they had a lot of rules to make sure that the debates were orderly, essentially. So only one person can speak at a time. They had to stand up and be addressed by the president in order to speak. They could only speak twice before everyone else had a chance to speak, so one person couldn't dominate the entire conversation.
We could use that today.
Yeah, we definitely could. Everyone got to be heard. They also couldn't make any rude remarks, no remarks in derision, they called it. So you couldn't mock other members or call them stupid or make personal attacks about them. And you couldn't talk about the debates outside of the debates themselves. So once they were
Oh,
done,
really?
you just went home. You couldn't be like continuing the conversation 3 days later when you saw someone in town.
Somewhat self-contained, issue to issue. It sounds a lot like sort of the Jeffersonian debate concept. He's really a pioneer in rules of order. Of course, anyone that follows Washington and Lee closely knows that Brian Alexander and the politics departments worked a lot with Thomas Jefferson's congressional rules of order. And I think the debate society was similar to Robert's rules of order. I think those are later in the 19th century. But this concept, there's almost a sense of mutual respect and decorum, and it is very procedural. Can you talk a little more about, because I remember seeing some of the minutes that you took scans of, and if anyone listening wants to see those, we're happy to share them and show you where you can access them in W&L special collections. But some of the rules seem somewhat specific and maybe, I don't know, humorous to read today. I recall there's one particular rule about, if you're late, there's a fine for that. It's like everything has a fine. It's sort of, I don't know, very legalistic in that sense.
Yeah, so one thing to know about the Franklin Society is they always seem to be in debt. So they seem to put a fine.
Really took after Jefferson, I guess. Yeah.
They put a fine or fee to pretty much everything. If you were absent from a meeting and you didn't have a, quote, good enough excuse, I don't know what a good excuse constituted of, but if you didn't have a good excuse, you would be fined 12 cents. If you were rude or you spoke when it wasn't your turn, you could be fined. If you didn't return a book to the library, you could be fined. Pretty much anything you could think of, there was a fine for.
Maybe that is something that everybody takes for granted today because Washington and Lee is in such a good financial position. Rockbridge County was not in really secure financial positioning in the 19th century, even into the 20th century. And things like the Franklin Society, which are sort of, I see almost as an extension of the university or the college in many ways. It's kind of a precarious position, right? There's a lot of debts, and as Washington College is hanging on through the decades, sort of surviving on the benevolence of big benefactors like John Robinson, Jockey John Robinson, and others, so too is the Franklin Society sort of floating around, hopefully we can stay open, keep our doors open. But can you tell me a little more about practically how it was kept open? I assume there were monthly or yearly dues that people paid, and then they probably had big benefactors as well that, contributed in whatever ways.
Yeah, so their main source of income came from the fees as well as stocks. And in order to be a member, you had to buy at least one share of stock. So that's how most of their money came in. They, of course, got donations as well. John Robinson was a benefactor for them as well. He gave them $200 to help construct their building in town, where the Palms is now, I believe.
Okay. Yeah, that's nice to know that his benevolence went far. We talked about him in the first episode of this series on Jockey John Robinson's legacy, and he donated to so many things beyond Washington and Lee, which is his greatest contribution. He gave to the Ann Smith Academy, which was the females' school next to the post office that was around pretty contemporary with the Franklin Society, actually, throughout the 19th century. So people like that helping keep it around. And you mentioned that there was a library for the society. So can you talk a little more about that? Was there a library from the start, or did that develop later on? What does that look like?
So the library was a big component of the Franklin Society because not only did they want civil discourse, but they wanted to have a library for anyone, member or not, to come and learn and educate themselves. So anyone in Rockbridge County could have access to the library if they paid a due, a one-time due. And it was really the project of one man, John Fuller. He was the librarian for about 50 years, so almost the entire run of the Franklin Society. And he was in charge of enlarging it, buying new books all the time to improve it, to get different topics included in it. And he was also responsible for saving it during the Civil War when the libraries of Washington and Lee and VMI were destroyed.
Oh, really? Yeah, that's a famous story at W&L. They destroy VMI, David Hunter's army, and the artillery captain, Henry DuPont, is firing on VMI, and the sort of allegory for W&L, or Washington College at the time, is that a professor approaches the artillerist and says, don't shell the school. That's George Washington on top of our building, not Jeff Davis. That's sort of the flavorful anecdote. But the college itself physically is spared, but the holdings of the college are ransacked, and pretty much most of the library is vandalized or stolen. A lot of the books actually get returned during Lee's presidency and for decades after. People write and say, oh, I stole this as a Union soldier in the fervor of 64. And then others get passed down and brought back over time just through descendants and such. But Washington and Lee, or Washington College, was looted, a lot of valuables destroyed, the chemistry apparatus was broken, and just a lot of damage. But you're saying the Franklin Society Library was kept intact pretty well.
Yeah, so the story goes that the Union soldiers tried to ransack it, but John Fuller stood at the top of the stairs and refused to let them through. How true that is, I don't know
Yeah.
if one man could stop a Union
Well,
army.
he was a librarian, so
Right,
you know,
right.
they're pretty tough.
Yeah.
But what happens to the library after the war? I assume it's pretty instrumental to Washington College, Washington and Lee, since their library was pretty depleted.
Yeah, so the library continues to flourish after the war. Membership kind of begins to skyrocket after the war because it paused during the war since so many people were away fighting. And it continued to prosper and do well pretty much up until Fuller's death in 1876. And then you see kind of the whole society start to decline. But that entire collection ultimately ends up going to Washington and Lee. So they have pretty much all of the Franklin Society's books today.
Oh, wow. So you could go to the library today and check out a book. Don't have to pay a due either, I guess.
Yeah, no, you don't. Yeah.
Unless you count being a student and paying tuition as the due, which is pretty hefty. But it seems like the Franklin Society is pretty important to the academic enrichment of the university, and that without that and without Fuller, who's the librarian, that you really wouldn't have the academic proliferation in the county that you do have, and that it really is an icon for the rest of the community. So tell me more about the debates. You said there's these records and constitution, bylaws, whatever in the archives. Do we have good record of what the debates themselves were, aside from how the debates have to be ordered? Like, what actually are people discussing, and how much detail do we have on that?
We have fantastic records of pretty much all of the debates, really. If you can go into special collections like I did when I was researching this, they have folders upon folders of all the different questions that they talked about. And these questions really ranged from a lot of different things. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of political questions, whether they be national or local or regional, religious questions. Since this was a Scots-Irish Presbyterian town, they had a lot of questions concerning Catholicism. How it was
Big fans, I bet.
And how much it was terrible for the American Republic, pretty much, and it wasn't compatible with this Republican government. Debated that quite a few times.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, and literary different questions about Julius Caesar, or different books, or just different whimsical questions like, oh, are bachelors and unmarried women, are they a nuisance to society? If so, which one's more of a nuisance? And they're like, well, no, they're not. So you can see what they were talking about, and sometimes, too, you can see what they voted to.
But not all the time. It sort of varies.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any topics that seem really worthwhile to dig into today? Like, if you're an aspiring researcher and you're looking for a good resource to dig into, are there any topics that might be worth comparing to a broader national movement or just worthy of further investigation?
I mean, one topic I thought was interesting, and I looked at this when I was researching both the Franklin Society, but also one of my research papers for a class I took here, was the topic of slavery and how that got discussed several times throughout the Franklin Society's run, and how the opinion kind of changed over time.
Oh, really?
To, like, we don't like slavery, but we can't necessarily get rid of it, more to, well, slavery's not that bad, actually. And you can kind of see through this small little group in Virginia them becoming more apologetic for it and more condoning of it. Also, hand in hand, the topic of secession, and how up until 1860, most of them were anti-secession and didn't want to leave the Union, but you see most of these people go and fight for the South anyway. And so I think that's really interesting to look at.
Yeah. Who are some of the ones that come to mind there?
Alicia Paxton, I know, was a big member of the society. He was actually pro-secession. And so he was an ardent fire eater, actually. But different people like Davidson, the Preston family in general, Governor John Letcher was a member, Robert E. Lee was a member, but he was after the war. Thomas Jackson, Stonewall Jackson was another member.
Oh, wow. So pretty much all the famous people buried in the cemetery were members is the
Yeah.
summary of it. So yeah, it seems, I don't know, maybe like a good case study. You could do almost a microhistory of it as reflective of broader Southern culture. The slavery question in particular I find interesting because, as was discussed in the recent episode I did in our Founding Philosophies podcast with David Gowdy, there's no statements ever discovered that the founding generation, any member, thought slavery was a moral good. They all sort of thought it was wrong and that it was an inherited system and that over time it'd be corrected. But this key notion that founding fathers weren't defending slavery in the sense that people like John Calhoun or some of the big fire eater secessionists in the 1850s and 60s would, and that is a cultural shift that occurs in the American South in the 1830s after Nat Turner and some of these big events. And historians have put a lot of great work into that, and I'm sure you've taken classes at WNL, as I did, that really go into that commentary. But I think it's interesting in Rockbridge County in particular because you have people like President George Junkin who come to campus, and he's the president before Lee and famously resigns after the students keep putting up the secessionist flag on the eve of the Civil War, and he says either make them stop or I'm quitting, and he's leaving the next day. But he was famously a pro-slavery defender in the sense that he wrote a biblical justification of slavery. And there's actually a pamphlet that he writes, and it's an argument that would never have been made 80 years before. But now it becomes pretty common in the South to hear these types of narratives using the Bible to justify the institution. And people like Junkin, who I assume was probably a member of the Franklin Society. I don't know if you came across his name at all, but I'd be surprised if he weren't.
I think he was a member. I came across his name a few times. I know he at least gave lectures there. And I think I read an anecdote about someone saying something rude about him, and Jackson, who was his son-in-law at the time, getting really defensive and almost
Make him
quit
pay
the
a fine.
society. Yeah.
Yeah.
Give him a fee. Yeah, I think he almost threatened to leave the society, and they were like, no, calm down. It's okay. You don't need to leave.
Mm-hmm. Well, so, yeah, he's a member, and you have this just change in perception, right? So maybe while he was a member, if they took up this question of the morality of slavery, the angle in the 1850s would have been a lot different than in the 1820s when they're debating it. So that really does seem worthy of research. Does it seem like many people have done much with the Franklin Society? Is there a lot of sort of secondary scholarship on it, or what's that look like?
I feel like there's not a ton of secondary scholarship. Most of what I came across during my research, if secondary at all, came from like the late 20th century. So there's definitely no new scholarship, I would say, upon it. A lot of it was old theses from like 1960s or something. So not a lot of recent development upon that subject.
Yeah, I bet you could do a lot of great stuff with even using AI or something now to sort of make some quantitative analysis of the different debates and how things, if we have such good records for it, sort of come up with some pretty comprehensive stuff. So I don't know, maybe you have some future research potential there. But I'd first heard about it as a freshman. I found some paper on JSTOR. I think I sent that to you when we were first talking about this, but it was paper maybe written in like the 1950s or 60s. And it was just fascinating how many correlations between these really important historical figures in the society and their role. And I thought, oh, this would be such a great thing to start back up at WNL. I know the older alumni here who sort of used to look through old calyxes and maybe have family members that went to WNL will know about the literary societies that used to be really big at the university. There's the Graham Literary Society and a few different ones over the years. And one of the big things was just debate, discourse, and they would have it's sort of intellectual clubs. And it just seemed like a really fun piece of WNL, something I would have liked to participate in, sort of like Tocqueville Forum or something, which I know comes and goes at WNL. I had the thought as a freshman, oh, maybe I could start the Franklin Society up, and I told my roommate, got all excited about it. And as with many ideas that I had about restarting some historical movement at WNL, it didn't get much traction and never really went off. But skip ahead, I guess 5-6 years later, and we're looking into this again. And I think I'd bookmarked that article on my phone on Safari for like years, and I was going through cleaning out all those bookmarks, and I found it again. I was like, oh yeah, this is great. And I reread the article and was like, wow, this is just as good 6 years later. And so I had the thought, TGR has been looking to do more civil discourse. That's a really big key component of our mission, certainly is in need at WNL. And so I thought, what if we, being a historical group, could sort of reconstruct this society and bring it back, reincorporate it. And that's exactly what we did, thanks to Louisa's research, thorough research. And we actually reformed the society, and that's why on our website we have a debate page now, and we have upcoming debates. We have one coming up on the speaking tradition and whether or not the speaking tradition is dead. Our hope is that having it at Fancy Hill sort of revitalizes this historical aesthetic, have it in an antique parlor, have rules of order, everybody dressed nice, no remarks in derision, no spitting on the floor. That was one of
that was another one, yeah.
rules. Yeah, we'll keep that one in there. Recreating the society and really trying to make it not just an opportunity for students, but for the broader community. Because again, I think that community aspect of debate is so critical. Talking with not just people who are the same age as you that you see every day in class or at work, but discussing with people who graduated 50 years ago, or professors who have had a different career trajectory than you plan to, just people who have a different outlook on life. And when you start getting those people together in a room from those different backgrounds, you really get a good discussion out of it and can have some of the serious, thoughtful, provoking conversations that the Franklin Society had 150, 200 years ago. So what's some of the interesting pieces to the Franklin Society that you think really should be, if the society continues today as we've reincorporated it, it's things that really need to be kept in mind? And I guess one of those too, if you want to talk more about it, is the promise that people sign. That's something that we've made a deliberate effort to implement.
Yeah, so in order to be a member, 4/5 of the current members had to approve you, and then you had to sign this promise, this oath, kind of like the honor system at WNO when you come in as a freshman and you sign the white book. But basically, you promise to never make any remarks in derision and contumely, to support the society, to attend your meetings, and to not discuss the debate matters outside of it. And so I think a lot of those things would be important for the new TGR Franklin Society to continue with, just the idea that you can have a debate with a bunch of different people and express your views. And when you leave, those views aren't always like tied back to you. You can leave it at the door and leave as normal people and talk like normal people outside of it, and not have to be like, oh, that's that one person who said that one thing, and that's all I think of when I see them now. I think that's so important, something you don't really see in society today.
Well, and it's so much easier now to isolate yourself in a bubble in the modern age and just on social media listen to the people that you like, and if you don't like the other political view and videos or whatever, your algorithm will stop giving those to you, right? And so it becomes very sort of tunnel vision. And I guess there's a similar experience of that in the 19th century in Rockbridge County, where most of the people are Presbyterian, most of the people are from a similar worldview, similar cultural heritage, Scots-Irish. So there is some similarities, but one of the best contributions of Lee's presidency is, and this sort of speaks to the latter half of the Franklin Society, is Lee ends the sectarian control of Lexington. And because he's so important and so famous, he brings people from around the country and even from other countries to Lexington to teach as educators, people that aren't traditional Presbyterian ministers. And Lee himself was Episcopal. Students who aren't from that same background, right? You start getting Catholic students, you get other denominations. There's even actually some Jewish students here in that era. And so you start getting people with different perspectives. And so all of a sudden your community is more diverse, and you have obviously more subjects that might be open to debate. So the fact that society continues for some time after is a good indication, and it's sad that it drops away and declines in that, you could even say, post-Lee period. But that, again, parallels that of the university, and they have a pretty bad decline in course offerings and enrollment and financial strength in that 1870s, 80s. and into the 1890s under the Custis Lee presidency. Again, just having an outlet for people who have different perspectives to be heard and to respect each other and hear that, you might not know it all about the various issues. And it sounds like the Franklin Society, some of their issues might have been heavier than others. If some of them were more philosophical or literary, it might not evoke the same concern or just sort of animosity in a meeting. And that's something we hope to do with the Generals Redoubt, is have some topics that are lighter than others and have some that are more serious. And, if people don't always want to debate the hardest things. So something like the speaking tradition, I don't think many people are going to get offended by that. But we hope to tackle some bigger topics like immigration and curricular reform and just things that are a little more sensitive, hot button issues. And I think this debate method is a good model for that. Do you have any other thoughts on the Franklin Society and what its legacy is, or important things that you'd hope your peers or anyone listening should keep in mind?
I think the most important legacy of the Franklin Society is this idea of civil discourse, where it's actually civil. It's a key part of the civil discourse, where you don't need to personally attack everyone for what they're saying, which is something that is so important in today's society, and something that literally everybody could take note of, is that you don't need to personally attack everyone for their views. You can sit and listen and be respectful and have disagreements. And they were able to do that pretty successfully for the most part during the latter half and early part of the 19th century. And so I think that's pretty much their legacy, is that they were actually able to hold civil discourse and disagree and agree on various different topics. And I think that's so important.
Absolutely. And again, that's a huge mission of the Redoubt. So if you are interested in learning more about that, or even in participating, we hope to do some sort of virtual hybrid event in the near future. Please visit our website and learn more about that. Again, we have a debate page that sort of tells you about the Franklin Society and its mission, why it's named after Franklin. And it really is a worthwhile endeavor that I think is going to improve the Washington and Lee community for the best. So thank you so much, Louisa, for joining in today. Do you have any other last thoughts before we wrap up?
I would encourage students, if they want to learn more about the Franklin Society or anything else in general, really, you can visit Special Collections. It's right there. There's so much there, a lot of history to learn. And besides Special Collections, Fancy Hill has a lot to offer. They have a lot of cool things. The new collection of calyxes are here.
Yeah. Just put on the shelves today, so very fresh collection. Well, thank you, Louisa, for all your hard work, and hope you have a great rest of your spring term and continue to teach us about Washington and Lee's rich history. Thanks, and thank you all for listening. Go Generals, and have a great day.
We're going to win again another time. For WNL, I yell, 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 yell. And for the